Welcome to Gettin Legal With It, a podcast for Colorado young lawyers by Colorado young lawyers. I'm your host, Kevin Chaney. For those listening to us for the first time, I'm a personal injury and criminal defense lawyer here in Colorado. I graduated from the University of Colorado Law School in 2014 and founded my practice, Chaney, Galluzzi & Howard, LLC, a short time later. I'm a member of the Colorado Trial Lawyers Association, where I serve on its board, executive committee, and legislative committee. I also serve on the Colorado Bar Association's Board of Governors and the CBA Executive Committee and the CBA Young Lawyers Division Executive Council. Finally, I'm also a member of the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar Association. If you're interested in learning more about any of these wonderful organizations, please feel free to shoot me an email at kevin@cghlawfirm.com. This podcast is created and sponsored by the Colorado Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division. Our goal with this podcast is to bring you bi-weekly episodes with information that is both fun and informative for young lawyers. We have some awesome guests lined up, and we are just getting started. If you like our podcast, please leave us a review and tell your colleagues. And with that, let's jump right in. I'm really happy to introduce our guest today. Elie Zwiebel is coming on to the podcast, and I think he's got a really interesting practice area that's going to be really useful and entertaining for a lot of our law student and young lawyer listeners. Prior to attending law school, Elie taught a variety of subjects and a diversity of students in the Detroit area, Chicago, Portland, Shenzhen and Nanjing. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Shenzhen
And Nanjing. Through these experiences, Elie developed a passion for student and family advocacy. During law school, Elie engaged in experiential learning opportunities as often as possible with movement and power-building nonprofit organizations, where he learned the importance of holistic and interdisciplinary approaches to legal advocacy. With the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, where he gained experience and familiarity with special education law, and with the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, where he contributed to investigating police departments, prisons, and mental health facilities for patterns and practices of discrimination. While in the University of Denver Civil Rights Clinic, Elie successfully petitioned President Obama to grant clemency to 2 individuals serving life sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. After spending 1 year as a judicial law clerk for Judge Norman Sierra in the 20th Judicial District, Elie is thrilled to now zealously represent students and their families in Colorado schools and courts. Elie has represented students, parents, and guardians in educational and juvenile justice matters through his solo practice since September of 2017, and now works as Colorado Juvenile Defender Center's Education First Program Director. Well, Elie, welcome to the podcast, and pleasure having you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you.
It's always interesting, the different bios and stuff. Yours was short and to the point, which I always appreciate having to read those. I kind of like to start off each episode the same way by just getting to know you a little bit and kind of introducing you to our listeners. So why don't you tell us a little bit about where you're from?
Absolutely. I was born in Littleton, raised in Centennial as soon as my part of Littleton was redistricted. And for college, I went off to University of Michigan for undergraduate. I graduated with a bachelor's in English and global media studies, which was University of Michigan's fancy way of saying film.
Okay.
So I minored in film, and from there I got into my teaching career.
And did you go to undergrad wanting to be a teacher, or was that something that kind of came up while you were at University of Michigan? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So while I was at University of Michigan, I started working with an organization called the Prisoners Creative Arts Project. And through that organization, I was able to facilitate various creative writing workshops around the Detroit area, specifically in juvenile detention facility and in an adult male correctional facility. And that experience really instilled in me the passion for teaching.
And so you were going into kind of these juvenile and adult kind of prison facilities and teaching them writing? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah. So typically we would prepare, a couple creative writing exercises. We would bring them in and have 2 or 3 writing exercises a week. And see what folks would put out there. Really powerful work tended to be with the younger folk. We would get amazing poetry. With the adult males, we would also get some excellent poetry, but mostly some really wonderful short fiction. And once a semester, we would organize a reading where individuals from the outside could come in and see kind of the, open mic of sorts.
And what drew you to that kind of prison and prisoner kind of work? Was that something that you had always been interested in, or was that something that kind of developed while you were in college? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I grew up in a Jewish family, and a strong message of social justice. In Hebrew, there's this expression. It's kind of a lesson from the Torah, tikkun olam, which means to repair the world, to clean the world. And it's sort of this obligation imposed upon the Jewish people to give back to the community and leave the world in a better place than how you arrived in it. So that was kind of a core value I had growing up. How it relates to the work I was doing in various detention facilities and correctional facilities, I think what happened was when I was signing up for courses, as an undergraduate, I saw the opportunity that there was this one really interesting English course that the reading list included Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and some Jonathan Kozol and various other authors and writers who had really explored the intersection of race, class, poverty, gender, and systems of oppression. Simultaneously with this class, we would be going into correctional facilities to facilitate a creative writing workshop. And there was just something about that blend that seemed like an amazing opportunity where I would also be getting undergraduate credit.
Right. Win-win for everybody.
Exactly. So it just kind of hit everything, all cylinders for me.
And from looking at the list of kind of where you have taught, it looks like you did a little bit of teaching in China. Is that where those places are?
Yeah. So Shenzhen is a city in southeast China. It is literally just across the border from Hong Kong, where my apartment in Shenzhen, I could literally walk to the border.
Okay.
It's also where I'm pretty sure all Apple products are made. It's an interesting little town in that a town of, I think, 15 million people.
So not too little per se.
Yeah, right. But it didn't actually exist now 40 years ago. It was sort of this experiment for China. And so it's become this capitalist enclave almost within the communist country. So I spent a year teaching English there. My second year in China, I was teaching in Nanjing, which is a little bit further north.
And what brought you to China? I mean, so you were teaching in America and kind of had this focus on, prisons and things like that and exploring that social justice aspect. Did you just kind of want to, see the world? And so you thought that China would be good, or what kind of brought you there?
A wonderful confluence of luck and hustle, which I think is actually a story throughout my life.
Sure.
Where the luck is both bad and good. The bad luck is that I graduated from college in 2009. So
great time to be finding a job.
Really wonderful time to be coming out of undergrad with a bachelor's in English, right?
Oh, yeah.
Lots of hiring happening. So, I mean, at the time, I applied to over 200 jobs.
Wow.
I used to know the exact number, but it's painful enough that I've forgotten it.
Those were the dark times.
Yeah, exactly. And they were jobs all across the board. Anything from, bar back, waiting tables, library acquisitions assistant, temp jobs, everything and anything in between. And the economy was in the trash and I couldn't find anything. I knew that teaching was something I was interested in. Fortunately, I had this connection to University of Michigan. They were promoting this program to teach English for a year in China. And I was accepted into the program, so that was the good luck side of it. Just the timing was right, and it worked out.
Nice. At that time, were you thinking law school at all? Was that something that you'd always kind of seen as like something that you would eventually do? Or tell us about your journey from teacher and then to China, and then what made you decide that law school was where you needed to be?
Sure. The short answer is no. I didn't know for sure I wanted to go to law school. I had taken the LSAT, but I didn't take a prep course. I didn't have a tutor or anything like that. Just kind of blindly went in and saw how I would do. We don't need to talk about what my score was that first time around. It was not great.
We've all been there.
And I think that was just reflective of I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the
Sure.
JD. And I wanted to pursue teaching. It honestly wasn't until I came back from China and spent some time teaching in Chicago. I was teaching a high school class. Specifically, I was as part of an AmeriCorps assignment. I was teaching a media class, actually, a media production class on the west side of Chicago in the North Lawndale neighborhood. And my students in this class would, at the beginning of the semester, learn very basic media decoding skills.
Sure.
So learning how to see an advertisement or an ad and say, here are the racist, sexist, heteronormative, ableist, whatever other biased imagery might be replicated in this image. And then over the course of the semester, we would impart to them, recording skills, both audio and video.
Sure.
So that by the end of the semester, they were making 30 second to 1 minute long public service announcements about issues that they thought were relevant in their low income housing neighborhoods.
Very cool.
I was very jealous. And then
That's awesome.
We had a few advanced students who were making senior projects that were like 10-minute long documentaries, also about subject matters of their choosing. One of them chose to make a documentary about the disparity in mortality rates between African American women and white women who had with breast cancer.
Sure.
Another student made a 10-minute documentary about code switching. I mean, fantastic stuff. And in the course of this work, I saw that my students were struggling with so many issues outside of the classroom.
Right.
In order to engage in what we were doing in the classroom, they had to kind of check some baggage at the door. While bringing their authentic selves and being able to engage in a raw, genuine way. And for the most part, they did that. But literally, the second they would step into the hallways, they would have school resource officers hassling them. They wouldn't have safe passage home. I had students who were, quite frankly, slinging drugs on the corner after school because they needed to help provide food for their family.
Right.
And at that point in time, I was starting to articulate, though I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary, I was starting to articulate in my own mind this term school to prison pipeline and seeing how it was impacting my students. And I wanted to be a more robust ally advocate for them. And to me, getting a JD was the route to that advocacy.
And, for our listeners that may not be familiar with that term, can you give us a brief description of what the school to prison pipeline is?
Sure. The school to prison pipeline is a system of policies that can either be at the school level or in the criminal or delinquency system that specifically target and criminalize behaviors that are part and parcel to being young. It's a system and practices that channel students from their school into our carceral state.
And so it was that system, I guess, that you kind of felt like, getting a JD would enable you to kind of fight against and enable you to kind of be part of the, solution or part of one of the many solutions to try to address that issue. Is that right?
That's right. Absolutely. So what we know is that harsh school discipline policies, the presence of law enforcement at schools, all of these things, even the presence of metal detectors at schools, not only target and literally channel students in through ticketing or arrests or referrals to law enforcement into our carceral state, but they also push, just quite frankly, students out of the classroom. And we know that more time spent out of the classroom leads to less engagement in your education, leads to less engagement, pro-social engagement in your community, and kind of predisposes folks to living in a carceral state. We also know that there is a disparate impact on students of color and students with disabilities, as well as students who identify as LGBTQIA. So just for example, here in Colorado, we know that in the last 6 years, Black students are 3 times more likely to be referred for suspensions than white students. Latinx students are 1.7 times more likely. We also know that students with disabilities are 2 times more likely than students without disabilities to be referred to law enforcement.
And it seems that system basically, as you were talking about, being in the classroom is one of the things that can actually help. And so whenever we have, any type of behavioral problem, whether there is an actual behavioral problem or just a perceived behavioral problem, we are, essentially suspending these students and kicking them out of school, which in turn makes the matter worse. Is that kind of what you're saying? That kind of, it's almost like a snowball effect, that the more that happens, almost the worse the behavior may become, and it kind of cycles until that person eventually, goes to prison or, has some other type of serious consequence.
Absolutely. Again, with the disparate targeting and impact that school discipline has, we know that the students who are most often targeted and most often disciplined are the ones who need the most support. They're the ones that need the most interventions, quite frankly. And so when we push them out of the classroom, the one space where they should be feeling safe, where they should feel like they can go any day of the week, that they are embraced, that they're going to be taught, that they're going to be provided an opportunity to excel and become the best person that they possibly can be. When we push them out of that, they're literally losing that time that day, and then they have to worry about making up class and catching up to their peers when we already know there's an education gap that they have to reconcile.
So we're going to pick up this topic a little bit later in the episode. I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about the type of law that you practice and kind of what the day-to-day looks like. So, from your website and everything, it seems that you practice essentially what is juvenile civil rights law. And it seems that has kind of arisen from, what we've just been talking about and kind of what you saw and what you identified as the problem and what drove you to law school. Can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, what it is exactly that you do and kind of what your practice area is?
Absolutely. So juvenile civil rights law, I'm not sure how many people you'll see out there who claim the moniker.
Yeah. It was really interesting when I read it. I was like, I haven't really heard of that one, but it's super fascinating.
Yeah. I felt like it was kind of shorthand to explain that I work at the intersection of education law and juvenile defense, for the most part. I do work on some adult cases here and there, but we can talk about that later. So I make sure I wear a few hats. I'll put it this way. And one of the hats I'll focus on right now, since you're asking about the day-to-day, is I contract with the Office of the Alternate Defense Counsel with juvenile defense teams. I work specifically as a mitigation specialist. So being an expert in education law, specifically in special education law, I will often investigate, gather, analyze education history, mental health history, and integrate that into mitigation strategy, whether that's early enough to influence plea negotiations, or if a kiddo is being charged as an adult and we're talking about preparing for a reverse transfer hearing and trying to present arguments to a judge. Wherever it is in the life of a case, I will make sure that either the district attorney or the judge is aware of where the ball was dropped for this individual student in the past, and how, if they had received everything that they should have received as a student with disabilities, as a student experiencing trauma, that they may not be where they are right now.
And so for our listeners that, aren't super familiar with either juvenile defense or criminal defense, when we talk about mitigation, it's really an attempt to explain to other individuals, whether those are DAs, prosecutors, judges, juries in certain situations, basically how we got here. And it seems like there's this tendency to basically only focus on the action. Like, person A, broke into this car and, stole a wallet, without understanding why person A broke into that car to steal a wallet, or how the things that happened to them when they were younger and the educational system and all of these different things along the way in many ways failed them. And now all of a sudden, they're here and they've done this action or allegedly done this action, and we want to hold them, basically solely responsible. And so when you talk about mitigation, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about basically explaining how we got here, in order to, humanize and hope that whoever's making the decision, takes that into account for maybe a less punitive sanction, or maybe a sanction that may actually help them, and improve the situation. Is that right?
Absolutely. So I think you've mentioned, it's both looking backwards to understand how we got where we are, and it's also looking forward to understand what will really work moving forward. And I think it's important to recognize, let's just say the alleged action is something that the individual committed, that they did it,
Yep.
that they're guilty. I would like to live in a society where none of us are held accountable for the rest of our lives for our worst day and our worst decision.
Right.
We all deserve an opportunity to atone, to take responsibility, and to be judged by the whole person that we are.
Sure.
So that is a lot of the work that I do as an ADC contractor, is ask prosecutors, ask the district attorney, ask judges, understand who this whole person is sitting in front of us. Their strengths as well as their weaknesses, and what has been lacking in their life.
It's interesting that you say that, and I'm sure in your area of law, you're very familiar with Brian Stevenson, who is one of, if not, the only person that I really consider one of my heroes. And he is very fond of saying, we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. And in his examples, we're talking about kids who have been accused of really horrific, events, murders and things like that. And that, even if you kill someone, you're more than just a killer. And if you steal something, you're more than just a thief. And it's a really interesting topic, because I think for most people, they don't want to be judged for the worst thing they've ever done. And, maybe that's not killing someone or something, but, almost to a person, I'd say that there's things that every person has done that they're not proud of, that they don't advertise, and they may be mortified or embarrassed if people found out that they had done. And so in their own lives, they, view it as, well, I don't want to be judged for the worst thing they've ever done. But, when it comes to criminal cases, and especially some of the more high profile ones, they kind of leave that at the door, and they're immediately like, oh, this person did X, and that is all they are. And they're like evil. And so I think it's really important, the work that you're doing, to kind of, shed a light on the holistic view of a person, that they're a human being, and they're more than, any one action, or even more than any series of actions, that kind of got them there. What does your typical day look like? So is most of it spent meeting and speaking with juveniles and like learning about them? Are you in court most days? Well, when COVID's not going on, are you in virtual court currently? Or what is like a typical day to, look like for you?
Yeah. One of the reasons I love practicing the law that I practice and in the way that I do it is I don't necessarily have a typical day. When I'm doing the work that we've already discussed, the sort of mitigation work, there's a lot of time spent at my computer, reviewing records and writing up reports, shooting off emails to defense team members. When I am representing students in expulsion hearings, or showing up at special education meetings, then I, in non-pandemic times, will be going to schools all around the state to do that work, or school district buildings. I also have the opportunity as Colorado Juvenile Defender Center's Education First program director to engage in community partnership work with various local organizations, grassroots movement organizations, and to do some legislative advocacy work here and there. So I feel very fortunate in that I get a lot of spice in my day.
Nice. It's always nice to have that variety. My last question kind of about this topic before we move on is a really fascinating area of law. And I got to believe that at least some of our law student listeners are listening and are like, that sounds really rewarding, or kind of identifies with my values or my drive to, help in the fight for racial justice and social justice and class justice. What advice for any law students that are kind of wanting to get into a similar area of law, whether it's not necessarily exactly the same thing, but in this kind of realm, what advice would you give to them?
If I can only, it's tough to pick one.
Right.
One piece.
Do we have 3 hours?
Exactly. Right. One piece of advice I got when I was, toying with the idea of opening my own practice, from a mentor and respected colleague, is get ready to hustle. And coming from law school, I think we all know what it takes to get through that, and it's not exactly easy.
Right.
For anybody who wants to start their own practice, the level of hustle you have to put into that is a whole other level. And I specifically work at this intersection where I'm representing indigent clients, which means I work with either state contracts or a nonprofit grant, which means this is not exactly a high-paying job.
Right. You're not going into this area of law to get rich.
Right. Exactly. So, I think in addition to being ready to hustle, be very in tune with yourself. I'm sure other folks you've had on the show have talked about self-care practices and the importance of really setting boundaries and knowing your limits, knowing what it takes to recharge your batteries. And I think it's juggling those two things, hustling and taking care of yourself.
Always really good advice. And yeah, that's one of the themes I think that a lot of different guests on the show have talked about is that self-care is really important, and taking care of yourself so that you can be your best self and be the best advocate you can for your clients. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about two organizations that I know you're a part of. I am familiar with both, but I'm really interested to kind of learn a little bit more about them. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about Colorado Attorneys Against Police Violence. So can you tell us a little bit about what that is and kind of why you got involved?
Sure. Colorado Attorneys Against Police Violence, or CAPV, as we call ourselves, is a loose coalition of attorneys from a broad array of practices. We have a few criminal defense attorneys, a few civil rights practitioners. We have had intellectual property attorneys, and I think at some point we even have had labor and employment attorneys. We arose in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery's murders in the wake of their killings and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. As many people were awoken last summer, awoken not being a real word, but
sure.
I think everybody understands what I'm saying.
What you're saying. Yeah.
There was a significant surge in activation amongst the legal community, and some folks wanted to organize some sort of effort from the legal community showing solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And a few of us who have been plugged into racial justice issues and the Black Lives Matter movement for a long time, since this isn't, Black Lives Matter didn't start in 2020.
Right.
Originally it dates back to 2014 and Michael Brown and all that was going on in Ferguson. So we kind of said, well, hold on a second. There is a system of power wherein lawyers often center the conversation on ourselves. And if we really want to approach allyship and standing in solidarity with intention, then we need to make sure we're doing this in service to the community.
Sure.
So a core tenet of the group is to elevate and amplify the voices of the community. So not to center the conversations on us as lawyers, but to leverage our skills and our power as lawyers to do that amplification and elevation of voice. So that's kind of the broad structure of the group. Everything we do, it's beautifully by consensus.
I think it's really important, the work that you guys are doing and, will continue to do, because I really do think that lawyers, rightly or wrongly, kind of occupy this special place in America. And I compare it to doctors with public health issues. People tend to trust doctors on public health issues. And even if it's not, their specific practice area, when a doctor, talks about the coronavirus or a vaccine or anything else, or, some type of healthy diet or whatever, they are given a level of credibility based on their occupation. And when lawyers, I think when you apply that to lawyers on issues of law and justice and politics and power, Like I said, for better or worse, I think that people tend to listen to lawyers, and, we have that, credibility. But I think you make a really good point that, just because we have that credibility doesn't mean that we need to be centralizing the activism about us, but rather to amplify the movements that are already there and the community activists that are proximate to these issues and are on the ground. So it's really a fascinating, organization. And I was able to attend one of the protests at Civic Center Park, where I believe Cap V kind of had a little march and spoke at one of those protests, and it was really powerful listening to some of the attorneys, people of color that were speaking there. If there are law students or lawyers that are listening to this and says, "Wow, that sounds like a really cool organization, something that I want to be a part of," what's the best way to get involved? What does Cap V, I guess, need in order to further implement its mission, if you will?
It's a fantastic question. And as I mentioned before, we operate on consensus. So our need shifts based on the shifting dynamic of what's happening in society. For me to sit here and say, here, I think the need is X. Right. I don't necessarily have the authority or the premature of the group to do that. But what I can say is, if you're interested in getting more involved in the work that CapV does to elevate community voices and elevate the work of other organizations, feel free to reach out to me. I know that at the end of the episode, I'll provide some contact information. So feel free to reach out to me. If you know of other folks who are involved in CapV, feel free to reach out to them, and we can talk about how to integrate you into our work.
Awesome. I'd like to discuss another organization that I'm actually a little bit more familiar with, having taught several of their classes myself, which is LYRIC, which stands for Learn Your Rights in Colorado, a really excellent organization that I've been proud to be a part of for a couple of years now. But for our listeners that don't know what LYRIC is or what it does, why don't you tell us a little bit about, kind of what LYRIC is and kind of what it does for the community?
Absolutely. So LYRIC, I'm on the board. We go into high schools, middle schools, after school programs, again, in the non-pandemic times.
Sure.
To teach young folk about their constitutional rights, specifically their 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights, and how to safely exercise those with law enforcement. In the pandemic times, we do this through Zoom.
And what was kind of the impetus, if you will, to the creation of LYRIC? Like, what problem was it trying to address or at least help out on?
Hannah Siegel-Prof and Michael Juba are the co-founders of LYRIC, and they were public defenders together. At the time, both primarily focusing, and they still do primarily focus on juvenile defense. When they were still in the PD's office, they identified that they wished that they could kind of catch some of the issues that were coming up before they even became issues. Right. And after a long time of brainstorming together and working together to figure out how to do that, they came up with the idea of LYRIC. Teach students how to protect themselves, how to protect their rights, and how to do that safely when interacting with law enforcement.
And, for people who are considering getting involved, I'm just going to give a personal plug for this organization. It is extremely rewarding to help young people understand their constitutional rights. And, obviously with the pandemic, everything is kind of, different, but I'm assuming that it'll eventually get back to some relative normalcy. And it was such a really cool experience for me. And it really depended on where I was going. So I've done, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 classes. And, some of them are in, groups of 25 or 30 at like a high school or a middle school. And that was such an interesting experience. But then some of them at kind of these like boys and girls clubs type, either alternative to suspension programs or after school programs where you're really interacting with like 2 or 3, maybe 4 individuals. Some of them are a little younger. And to really just be able to sit down and have conversations with these young people was really rewarding and, something that I think had a really big impact on, how I view the law. How do people get involved? So I know one of the common questions when I've talked about lyric with other attorneys is, I don't do any criminal defense work. I don't do any juvenile work. Can I still help out with lyric?
Absolutely.
And how I guess do they go about getting that, and what kind of training does lyric offer?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't need to be a defense attorney. You don't need to even practice in the criminal law system. Lyric will be happy to have you as a volunteer. And Lyric does not allow people to go out and teach Lyric classes until they've gone through training and also shadowed a few classes instructed by somebody who's already been volunteering for some time. The instruction to be a trained Lyric volunteer is relatively brief. It's maybe, a 1 hour, 2 hour crash course on, again, 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment rights, as well as a crash course on the standard PowerPoint that we use in all of our classes, and how to teach that effectively. One of the things that we've been doing during the pandemic is making those resources in terms of training volunteers more accessible. So keep your eyes peeled on the Lyric website for that.
Awesome. And I, like I said, having done a few of these, I've taught with anything from I think it was either a tax or a family law attorney. And for our law student listeners, I know at least at DU Law, you guys have actually, and you fill me in on the details here, but I think there's either some type of program or something, but I know that there's been a lot of DU law students. I don't know if you guys are up at CU yet, but that I've taught classes with DU law students. So is this something that even law students can get involved in and participate in?
Yes. So if you're a law student, specifically if you're a 1L or a 2L, keep your eyes peeled because we are recording this in what would be the tail end of the winter semester of 2021.
Sure.
So 1L, 2L students, keep your eyes peeled for the next few semesters. Hannah has been working together with Dean Freeman to put on a class there that trains law students on how to teach a Lyric class. I know that there are students from DU right now, from Sturm College of Law, who are leading Lyric classes. And I believe Hannah is working on rolling out a similar initiative at CU.
Awesome. And yeah, I can't plug it enough. I know also, and again, at least in pre-pandemic times, you guys do a annual fundraiser down at one of the breweries in Rhino.
Our mutual friend.
I was like, I know it's right down there. And so if any listeners, would like to support them monetarily, that's always something that, these organizations can help out. Come out and, get a nice craft beer and, support a worthy cause. They had I believe a silent auction at the last one that I was at, and a bunch of different cool ways to get involved. Our last topic today, and I think this will kind of bring us full circle to some of the stuff that you were talking about earlier at the beginning of our episode, is this idea of movement lawyering. And it's something that I think you can kind of hear of and kind of maybe guess where it's going, but what does movement lawyering kind of mean to you? And we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. So often when I explain this, I start with a more familiar term, I think, for a lot of attorneys, which is client-centered lawyering. Mm-hmm. The idea that, lawyers, we might know what we've studied. We might know how to use Westlaw or Lexis or CaseMaker or whatever. And we might know how to very strictly apply facts to law and advocate for our client or put together a contract, whatever. Client-centered or client-focused lawyering would be, what's going on for the person who has come to see me for help. It's more than just this discrete legal issue. Yes, I have to address that, but let me try to understand really some of the collateral interests and really what's going on and get a holistic view of the person who's in my office.
Right.
Now, substitute client for movement, and you will get almost the exact same concept. Why is this organization seeking legal assistance? Or if they haven't sought legal assistance, what can I as an attorney bring into this movement based on my profession, my skills, my training, the privilege of my education to elevate the movement, to help take it to the next level without co-opting it, without centering it, again, like we discussed earlier, on me and my agenda. So it can get very complicated because I think as lawyers, we like having that discrete answer, if for no other reason than ethics. Who is my client?
Right.
What are they telling me to do? So it can get very tricky. But I think recognizing that again, if we approach a movement saying we're not necessarily representing anybody, we are skill sharing. We are adding to that movement based on what we have as assets.
And, I think this may, be rather obvious, but in large movements, large groups, there's a diversity of thought even within that movement. Black Lives Matter is a prime example. There are, advocates from BLM in different cities or even within the same city that have different views and different ideas and different goals. And so it sounds like part of what a movement lawyer does is not necessarily try to impose their own views, but try to distill what the movement is seeking and trying to figure out how you can best be of assistance. Is that right?
I think that's right. And I really appreciate you framing it that way because, again, I think given our training, at least the typical law school pedagogy kind of imparts on us that the answer will always be in the law, that it'll be litigation, drafting legislation, or drafting a contract or something like that. Some skill that is typically a legal skill. Realistically speaking, for movements, the law isn't always going to be the answer. They might not always need a lawyer to flex their lawyer muscles. They might need a lawyer to help put together a flyer that distills the complex web of Fourth Amendment law into 6 bullet points that are relevant to protesting.
Right.
They might need somebody who can help prepare somebody for a media appearance, right? Distill talking points. So it might not always be the law that is the tool we reach for. The law is very much a hammer. And as we all know, not everything requires a hammer. Sometimes we need a scalpel. Sometimes we need a chisel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, again, by privilege and power of our education, we can contribute to movements by assessing, what tool do we need right now? Am I the one to help provide this tool? Or am I just a warm body in the room because they need people power?
Right.
They need me to show up.
Right. This conversation has really reminded me of one of the most powerful lessons that I learned at law school when I was at CU. And it's told to me by a gentleman by the name of Ahmed White. And he taught criminal law. He also taught labor law up at CU Law. And it was one of the 1L classes, and I can't even remember. It was a few weeks into law school. And so Professor White, if you're listening, this really hit home for me. And he said, the commonly accepted idea that lawyers are simply neutral warriors for black and white letter law is a lie. And it's a lie that is commonly taught throughout law schools and throughout our system, and that the idea that we are essentially just supposed to walk into any situation and neutrally apply the law, it just simply isn't true, because it misses a larger truth, which is that the law was written by people. People that experience racism and classism and power dynamics and power structures. And if you go to law school simply to be someone who neutrally applies the law, you're really missing out on what we were talking about earlier, kind of the social responsibility of a lawyer. And it sounds like the movement lawyering, in some aspects, is really addressing that question, that it's not just about what the law is, but it's what the law should be, and how we can, as lawyers, empower communities, empower non-lawyers, empower movements to build a more just society, and that is really a higher calling for legal professionals.
Absolutely. The law is a self-sustaining power structure. And I'm not going to get over here and get on a soapbox spouting anarchist ideology.
Right.
The people, as you say, who wrote the laws, whether you want to date back to 1776, before then, more recently, by and large, wealthy white male.
Sure.
Right.
And that's true.
I think what we're seeing in movement space right now and in our society, one of the greatest tensions, and without getting too political here, is as we're seeing an increase in representation, an increase in voice to those folks who have been traditionally marginalized and historically oppressed in our society, we are seeing a progressive shift in the law, and we're seeing a tension as there's pushback on that. And I think when we look at the politics over the last however many years you want to count them, but especially recently, there is that tension between what happens when we increase representation and we amplify the voices of those who have been pushed to the margins, when the folks who have the self-sustaining power structure are trying to cling to that.
And it's been really interesting, for me as someone who's been, active in the Bar Association, and really, I think something that's made me really happy and hopeful for the future is how much all of this is kind of coming together in this moment. The CBA in Colorado, which is not the world's most diverse state. In the lawyer profession, which is not the world's most diverse profession in not the world's most diverse state.
Right.
We hadn't always, it's just honest. We hadn't always done a very good job on a lot of these topics. Over the last couple of years, I think we've seen a real increase on the focus of not only paying lip service to DEI, initiatives, but making sure that diverse individuals are leading those initiatives, and that, oftentimes the best thing a lawyer can do, and as someone, like myself, who I know you guys are just hearing my voice, but I have pretty much every, privilege that a person can have as a, straight white male, raised in an upper middle class family, is oftentimes just listening. And now we have a podcast that I will, give a shout out here for, Our Voices, which is really promoting diversity in the legal profession. I know the CBA YLD has done some really excellent TED Talks about these kind of diversity issues. And I think that is carrying over into the way that people view the law. And people see things like, what happened with George Floyd and different, other aspects, and be like, to the extent that was the law, then maybe the law was wrong. Maybe we need to, get proximate to these movements to see how we can, change that for, going forward. And it sounds like that really is kind of what you decided to do, and kind of your practice area is in service, I guess, of that idea.
Absolutely. I think you're hitting it on the head. Look, we're two white guys, two lawyers who are white, right, talking right now about these issues, and that is the traditional problem. And I think, as you say, it's really important that we, you and I specifically, given our identities, our privileges, and the powers that we have, are ready to listen anytime that I find myself pushing back on a concept in a conversation. Instead of immediately voicing that, inquire, where is that coming from? Where is this discomfort coming from? And I check that. I think it's also really important to not show up to the work expecting that somebody else will tell you what to do, or that somebody else will have the answers. I think it is this balance of showing up ready to do the work, ready to hustle, and having some ideas, but then being also aware of our identity and being ready to listen, as you said.
And I guess to kind of supplement that as well is, to my fellow privileged individuals, it can sometimes feel uncomfortable, right? It's not like you can just flip a switch and everything, that you've learned, you're going to unlearn, and that I was a person, and I can't remember the term off the top of my head. Moderate male confidence. I can't remember what but basically there is this, the thing, I have never had a problem raising my hand in class. Like, I volunteer to answer every question. And so I have this, as soon as I walk into a room and hear something, like, my hand always wants to shoot up and be like, let me offer my opinion. And it has been uncomfortable for me, but important, I think, for me to experience being in the room and be like, you know what, Kevin, you don't have anything to add to this conversation. Just listen. Like, just spend the whole meeting listening. And I'm not perfect. And so, sometimes I do feel like myself, like, raising my hand and kind of jumping in a conversation. But it's a process. And so for any of our listeners, that are trying to get involved in this kind of work, or, it's not something that's going to instantly just click for you. And it's okay to feel uncomfortable, and it's okay to be less than perfect, as long as you're kind of, I think, striving in that direction. Well, Elie, thank you so much for coming on. I don't think we've had an episode quite like this, and it's a really super fascinating area of law that you're in, and it's such an important problem. And it's one that's, really been on, unfortunately for, negative reasons, because all of these, terrible atrocities keep happening to people of color, and we keep seeing these same things reinforced. But it's one that's really been at the top of the public's kind of imagination, if you will. So thank you so much for coming on. You were correct earlier. We like to end each episode the same way. If anyone is interested in getting in contact with you, either about Colorado Attorneys Against Police Violence, Lyric, your practice area, movement lawyering, any of those topics, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Absolutely. Please do reach out to me. I love working with younger attorneys, with students to brainstorm. For our DU students out there who are interested in learning more about movement lawyering, which is a practice of elevating the voices of folks who are not lawyers and decentering the lawyer's voice, me being a lawyer, and also a conversation about racial and social justice, which necessarily involves a centering of voices from those who are not white males, myself being a white male. I really encourage you to reach out to Dean Lexi Freeman. She helped me understand what movement lawyering is, and she regularly runs a course with her husband at the law school. For all law students in Colorado and elsewhere, and other young lawyers, please reach out to your local chapters of the National Lawyers Guild. This is an organization that has been doing movement and client-centered progressive lawyering for decades. And for those who are interested in national organizations that have helped me formulate my understanding of racial justice-driven movement lawyering, especially in the fight to end the school-to-prison pipeline and against our police and carceral states, I recommend looking up the work of Judith Brown Dianis and Advancement Project, as well as the work of Marbury Stolley Butts and Law for Black Lives. You can reach me at my practice, which is eliezwiebel@gmail.com. That's ELIEZWIE, B as in Bravo, E as in Echo, L as in Lima, law@gmail.com. Or you can reach me at my CJDC, my Colorado Juvenile Defender Center email address. That's ellie@cjdc.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And thank you for all the important work that you're doing for our community.
Thank you so much for having me and for carving out space for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Get legal with it.